Hey guys, tonight we journey into the heart of Southeast Asia, where ancient waters once held secrets that would make even the gods jealous. We're diving into the lost floating cities of the Khmer Empire, settlements that danced on lakes and rivers like mirages made real. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on the shores of Tonle Sap, the Great Lake of Cambodia. But this isn't the lake you might know today. This is the 13th century, and the water stretches farther than your eyes can see, a liquid highway that breathes with the monsoons. In the distance, something impossible catches your eye. Not islands, not mirages, but entire cities floating on the surface like lotus blossoms made of wood and stone. The morning mist clings to structures that shouldn't exist. Houses built on stilts, so tall they pierce the sky. Markets that bob gently with the current, temples where monks chant prayers that echo across water instead of stone courtyards. This is the world the Khmer Empire built, not just on solid ground, but on the very element that gave life to their civilization: water. You wade into the shallows, your feet sinking into mud that has swallowed centuries of secrets. The water is warm, almost body temperature, and as you move deeper, you realize you're not just entering a lake. You're stepping into the bloodstream of an empire that understood something we've forgotten: that water doesn't divide civilizations. It connects them. Archaeological evidence scattered across Southeast Asia tells us the Khmer didn't just build Angkor Wat and call it a day. They were master hydraulic engineers who understood water like a musician understands melody. But while everyone talks about their stone temples, fewer voices whisper about their floating achievements. The cities that rose and fell with flood seasons, communities that lived in harmony with waters that could be both generous mother and vengeful destroyer. Imagine houses that could rise 20 feet when the floods came, supported by stilts carved from ironwood that refused to rot even after decades underwater. Picture markets where vendors sold fish still dripping from nets cast moments before, where rice wine flowed as freely as the currents beneath their feet. These weren't primitive settlements clinging to survival. These were sophisticated urban centers that had mastered the art of living with water instead of fighting against it. The French explorer Henri Mouhot, who stumbled upon Angkor in the 1860s, wrote fragments about communities he glimpsed from his boat settlements that seemed to materialize from mist and disappeared just as quickly. He described them as phantom cities, places that existed only when the waters were right, when the seasons aligned, when the gods smiled down on the floating world of the Khmer. But Mohat saw only echoes. By his time, most of these aquatic metropolises had already vanished, swallowed not by conquest or fire, but by the changing moods of water itself. What he witnessed were the descendants, the survivors, still clinging to an ancient way of life that their ancestors had perfected centuries before. You push deeper into our reconstructed past, and the water reaches your chest now. Around you, the sounds of a floating city come alive. The gentle slap of waves against wooden hulls, the creak of bamboo joints flexing with the current. Voices calling across the water in Khmer, haggling over prices, sharing gossip, singing lullabies to children who learned to swim before they could walk. The engineering marvels these people achieved still boggle modern minds. They didn't just build houses on stilts and hope for the best. They created entire urban systems that could adapt to water levels that might vary by 30 feet between dry season and flood season. Houses that could telescope upward when the waters rose, granaries that floated like ships but remained anchored to underwater foundations, roads made of bamboo that flexed with the current but never broke. Some historians argue these floating cities were born of necessity. When your empire controls vast river systems and seasonal lakes, you learn to live with water or you don't survive at all. But archaeological evidence suggests something more profound was at work. The Khmer didn't just tolerate water, they worshipped it. They understood it as the source of all life, the medium through which their gods moved across the earthly realm. The great lake Tonle Sap itself was considered sacred. During certain seasons it flows backward, defying the natural order in a phenomenon that the Khmer saw as divine intervention. When the Mekong River floods each year, it forces the Tonle Sap to reverse its flow, turning a modest river into a vast inland sea. The lake can expand to more than 6 times its dry season size, creating thousands of square miles of new territory that exists only when the waters permit. In this liquid landscape, the Khmer built cities that could disappear and reappear with the reliability of sunrise. When the floods came, entire communities would rise with them, their houses climbing skyward on stilts, their boats becoming the main streets of elevated neighborhoods. When the waters receded, the cities would settle back down, revealing rice paddies and markets that had been underwater just months before. You float now, your feet no longer touching bottom, and you realize you're swimming through the ghost of a marketplace. Beneath you, ceramic shards rest in the mud, fragments of pots that once held fish sauce and rice wine. Around you, the water carries whispers of commerce that once thrived here. The splash of oars as merchants navigated between floating shops, the calls of vendors announcing fresh catches, the laughter of children who treated the lake not as an obstacle, but as their playground. The social structure of these floating cities was as complex as their engineering. Families didn't just live on the water, they organized themselves around it. The wealthiest merchants built their houses in the deepest sections, where the water was most stable and their large vessels could dock easily. Fishermen clustered in shallower areas, where they could quickly access the best fishing grounds. Farmers chose locations where they could easily transition between floating homes during flood season and land-based agriculture when the waters receded. Religious practices adapted to this aquatic lifestyle in fascinating ways. Buddhist monks didn't just meditate in land-based temples. They created floating monasteries, structures that moved with the water levels, ensuring that spiritual guidance remained accessible to communities regardless of the seasonal floods. These floating temples became centers of learning and culture. Libraries where palm leaf manuscripts were kept in waterproof containers. Schools where children learned to read while sitting cross-legged on platforms that swayed gently with the current. The art and architecture of these settlements reflected their unique relationship with water. Buildings weren't just raised on stilts for practical reasons. They were designed to be beautiful when viewed from the water, with intricate carvings that could be appreciated by someone approaching in a boat. Roof lines followed the curves of waves. Decorative elements incorporated water motifs, lotus flowers, and stylized fish that seemed to swim across wooden beams. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these floating cities was their sustainability. Long before modern environmentalists coined terms like living with nature, the Khmer had perfected the practice. Their cities didn't fight against seasonal floods. They danced with them. They didn't try to control the water. They learned to read its moods and adapt accordingly. The agricultural systems integrated seamlessly with urban life. Floating gardens produced vegetables that could be harvested year-round. Fish farms created protein sources that required minimal maintenance. Rice paddies that flooded and drained with natural cycles produced yields that sustained not just the floating communities, but much of the broader Khmer Empire. You surface now, gasping slightly, and look around at the reconstructed scene. The sun is setting, painting the water gold and orange, and you understand why the Khmer saw divinity in these moments. The floating cities aren't just historical curiosities. They represent a completely different way of thinking about human settlement, about the relationship between civilization and environment. Modern urban planners studying climate change and rising sea levels have begun looking back at these ancient solutions. How did the Khmer create cities that could adapt to dramatic changes in water levels? How did they maintain urban services and social structures in communities that literally rose and fell with the seasons? How did they create sustainable food systems that worked in harmony with natural flood cycles? The answers lie buried in mud and memory, scattered across a landscape that has been transformed by centuries of change. But the echoes remain. In villages around Tonle Sap, you can still see descendants of these ancient techniques. Houses that rise on stilts, boats that serve as primary transportation communities that organize their entire calendar around the rhythms of water. As darkness settles over the lake, you realize this is just the beginning of our journey. We've glimpsed the surface of these lost floating cities, but beneath the waters lie deeper mysteries. How exactly did these engineering marvels work? What daily life was like for the people who called the water home? And most intriguingly, why did these remarkable settlements eventually disappear, leaving behind only fragments and legends? The night sounds of the lake begin to emerge, the splash of fish jumping, the rustle of water plants in the breeze, the distant call of night birds. And somewhere in those sounds, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echo of voices from the past speaking across centuries about cities that lived and breathed with the rhythm of water itself. You wade deeper into the reconstructed past, and the water around your waist carries stories written in currents that have flowed for 1,000 years. Here, where the lake bed slopes gently toward deeper mysteries, you begin to understand how the Khmer transformed engineering challenges into architectural poetry. The foundations beneath your feet aren't stone or concrete, but something far more ingenious. Massive wooden posts, some as thick as ancient trees, driven deep into the lakebed clay. But these weren't just random pilings hammered into mud. Archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating sonar have revealed intricate patterns, geometric arrangements that distributed weight and stress across underwater networks spanning entire city blocks. The Khmer engineers understood something that modern builders are only rediscovering. Water doesn't just support structures, it actively participates in their stability. They designed their foundations to work with hydraulic pressure rather than against it, creating buildings that grew stronger as water levels rose, their stilts acting like enormous shock absorbers that could flex with currents and waves. Picture the morning ritual in these floating neighborhoods. Before dawn, when mist still clung to the water's surface, families would emerge onto their floating platforms to begin the day. But this wasn't the simple rural lifestyle that outsiders might imagine. These were sophisticated urban dwellers who had adapted metropolitan living to an aquatic environment. The grandmother of the house might check the water level markers carved into the support posts, reading the overnight rise or fall like a barometer of the season's mood. Children would splash into the lake for their morning bath, their laughter echoing off houses that stood like graceful herons in the shallows. Mothers would lower baskets on ropes to scoop up the day's cooking water, already knowing which sections of the lake provided the cleanest supply. But the real magic began when the markets opened. Imagine merchant boats gliding between the stilted houses like gondolas in an Asian Venice, their hulls heavy with goods from across the empire rice, from the paddies that bordered the lake, spices from the mountain forests, silk from worms raised on floating mulberry farms, fish so fresh they were still gasping as they changed hands. The floating markets weren't just economic necessities. They were the heartbeat of these communities, places where news traveled faster than the current, where marriages were arranged and business partnerships forged. Vendors didn't just sell products. They carried stories, gossip, and information that connected isolated lake communities to the broader world of the Khmer Empire. You drift toward what would have been the administrative center of one such floating city, and the water here tells a different story, deeper, calmer, marked by the foundations of structures that clearly served purposes beyond simple housing. These were the floating palaces, the government buildings that housed the complex bureaucracy needed to manage communities that existed in 3 dimensions. The Khmer administrative system had to account for vertical space as well as horizontal territory. Tax collectors needed to know not just which houses existed, but at what water level they could be accessed during different seasons. Court records had to track property boundaries that shifted with the floods. Legal disputes arose over fishing rights in areas that might be deep water one month and dry land the next. Religious architecture in these floating cities reached heights of innovation that would challenge modern engineers. The great floating temples weren't just buildings raised on stilts. They were mechanical marvels designed to maintain perfect spiritual orientation regardless of water conditions. The main prayer halls could rotate slightly as their foundations shifted, ensuring that Buddha statues always faced east toward the rising sun. Temple bells hung on adjustable chains that compensated for the structure's movement, their bronze voices carrying across water that amplified sound in ways the architects had carefully calculated. Monks developed chanting techniques that used the lake's acoustics, their prayers echoing off the water's surface to create harmonies impossible on dry land. The preservation of sacred texts in this environment required innovations that scholars are still studying. Palm leaf manuscripts were stored in specially designed containers that could float if the temple flooded unexpectedly. These waterproof libraries contained not just religious writings, but the technical manuals that explained how to maintain and repair the floating infrastructure. As you swim deeper into this reconstructed world, the water pressure reminds you that these cities existed in a three-dimensional environment that most urban planners never consider. The Khmer had to think like underwater architects, designing for forces that came from below as well as above, for loads that shifted not just with wind and weather, but with tides and currents. The social hierarchy of floating cities reflected this vertical reality. The deepest houses, built in water that never receded, belonged to the wealthiest families. These permanent floating residences were engineering masterpieces, their multiple levels designed for different water conditions. Ground floors that could flood without damage, living spaces that began 20 feet above the dry seasoned lake bed. Upper levels that remained comfortable even during the most severe floods. Middle-class families built in zones that dried out during the lowest water periods. Their houses designed to settle gracefully onto solid ground when the lake receded. These amphibious homes had to be equally functional, whether surrounded by water or resting on earth. Their foundations strong enough to support the structure's full weight. Their stilts flexible enough to lift the living spaces when floods returned. The poorest residents lived in the shallowest areas, in houses that spent much of the year on dry ground. But even these humble structures incorporated sophisticated flood-ready design walls that could be quickly dismantled and reassembled at higher levels. Roofs designed to float if separated from their foundations. Furniture that could be stacked and secured when the waters rose. Food production in these aquatic cities required techniques that modern urban farmers are only beginning to explore. Floating gardens created year-round growing space that moved with the water levels. These weren't simple rafts with plants on top, but complex agricultural systems that used the lake itself as a nutrient source. The floating garden platforms were built from layers of water hyacinth and other aquatic plants, compressed and bound together to create growing medium that was both buoyant and fertile. As the organic material decomposed, it released nutrients directly to the plant roots. While the water below provided constant irrigation, fish swam beneath the gardens, their waste adding fertilizer, their presence controlling insect pests. Crop selection for floating agriculture required deep understanding of both horticulture and hydraulics. Plants had to tolerate constantly moist conditions while producing food that could be harvested from boats. Vegetables were chosen for their ability to grow quickly before seasonal floods might sweep the gardens to new locations. The fishing industry in these floating cities operated on scales that boggle the modern mind. Entire neighborhoods were organized around different fishing specialties. Some areas focused on breeding fish in enclosed pens that rose and fell with water levels. Others specialized in deep water fishing, their houses positioned to provide easy access to the lake's center, where larger fish schooled. Fish processing and preservation happened on floating platforms designed specifically for the purpose. Smoking houses built over the water used the lake's humidity to cure fish in ways that enhanced both flavor and shelf life. Salt works evaporated lake water during dry seasons, producing the salt needed to preserve the catch during times of abundance. The transportation networks that connected these floating cities were marvels of logistics and engineering. Water roads marked by floating buoys guided boat traffic between neighborhoods. Canal systems carved into the lakebed created deeper channels that remained navigable even during low water periods. Harbor areas used mechanical systems to accommodate boats regardless of the water level, with floating docks that could rise and fall on guided posts. You surface again, treading water in what would have been a major intersection of these aquatic highways. And the complexity of what you're experiencing becomes overwhelming. This wasn't just a collection of houses on stilts. It was a complete reimagining of urban life. A civilization that had solved problems we're only now beginning to recognize as we face our own challenges with rising seas and changing climates. The night deepens around you, and bioluminescent plankton begin to sparkle in the water, disturbed by your movement. In the distance, the lights of modern fishing villages twinkle like earthbound stars. Descendants of these ancient floating cities still carrying on traditions that stretch back through centuries of adaptation and innovation. But as beautiful as this reconstructed vision might be, darker currents flow beneath the surface. The very adaptability that made this floating cities possible also made them vulnerable in ways their builders couldn't have anticipated. The same waters that gave life could also take it away, and the forces that would eventually claim these remarkable settlements were already stirring in the depths of history, waiting for their moment to rise. The water grows colder as you dive deeper into the lake's memory, and here, where sunlight has never touched the bottom, the real secrets lie buried. This is where the floating cities met their match, not in war or conquest, but in the inexorable forces that govern water itself. The very element that gave birth to these marvels would eventually become their destroyer. You feel it in the currents that tug at your clothes, the subtle shifts in pressure that speak of massive hydraulic changes. The Khmer engineers who built these floating cities understood water better than perhaps any civilization before or since. But even they couldn't predict how their empire's success would ultimately doom their aquatic achievements. The irony cuts through the dark water like a blade. As Angkor grew into the largest pre-industrial city in the world, its massive temple complexes and expanding population demanded water management on an unprecedented scale. The same hydraulic expertise that created the floating cities was redirected toward land-based projects. Enormous reservoirs called barrays were carved from the earth. Canals were dug to feed the growing stone metropolis. The water that had once supported floating neighborhoods was increasingly channeled toward supporting fixed settlements. But water, as the Khmer knew better than anyone, doesn't like to be controlled for long. The massive engineering projects around Angkor began to alter the natural flow patterns that had sustained the floating cities for centuries. Rivers changed course slightly. Seasonal flooding patterns shifted by degrees that seemed insignificant year by year, but accumulated into catastrophic changes over generations. Archaeological evidence from the lake bed tells a story written in sediment layers. Core samples reveal periods when the natural flood cycles that had sustained the floating cities became erratic. Some years brought floods so severe that even the highest stilts couldn't lift houses to safety. Other years saw droughts that left the floating platforms stranded on dry land, their carefully balanced ecosystems collapsing as the water retreated beyond memory. The social fabric of these communities began to fray as the environmental foundations cracked. Families that had lived on the water for generations found themselves forced to choose between abandoning their homes or watching them slowly die. The complex networks of floating markets and water roads that had connected dozens of settlements began to fragment as communities disappeared one by one. You sink deeper, your lungs beginning to burn, and in the pressure you feel the weight of all that lost knowledge. The floating cities weren't just abandoned buildings left to rot. They were living repositories of techniques and wisdom that took centuries to develop and mere decades to lose. When the last floating temple finally sank beneath the surface, it took with it architectural secrets that modern engineers are still trying to rediscover. The religious implications of this collapse rippled through Khmer society in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. These floating temples weren't just places of worship. They were proof that humans could live in harmony with the natural world, that civilization didn't have to conquer nature to thrive. When they disappeared beneath the waters, they took with them an entire worldview, a way of thinking about humanity's place in the cosmos. The monks who had maintained these aquatic monasteries faced an impossible choice. They could follow their communities to dry land, abandoning centuries of water-based spiritual practice, or they could remain with their sinking temples, becoming guardians of ruins rather than guides for the living. Many chose a middle path, establishing new temples on solid ground, but incorporating water elements that honored their floating heritage. The economic collapse followed the environmental disaster like a shadow. The floating cities had been crucial nodes in trade networks that stretched across Southeast Asia. Merchants from China and India had learned to navigate the seasonal rhythms of these aquatic markets, timing their arrivals to coincide with the periods when the floating cities were most accessible and prosperous. As the cities became unreliable, trade routes shifted. Merchants found new paths that bypassed the troubled waters. The wealth that had sustained these communities for centuries began flowing elsewhere, leaving behind populations that had specialized in aquatic skills. suddenly finding their expertise irrelevant in a drying world. You surface gasping, the night air sharp in your lungs, and realize you've been swimming through more than water. You've been immersed in the tragedy of adaptation pushed beyond its limits. The floating cities weren't destroyed by invaders or natural disasters. They were victims of their own empire's success, casualties of progress that couldn't account for the delicate balances their existence required. But the story doesn't end in simple tragedy. As you float on your back, looking up at stars that have watched empires rise and fall for millennia, you begin to see the threads that connect past to present. The knowledge didn't disappear completely. It went underground, or rather, underwater, preserved in the practices of communities that modern development has largely overlooked. In remote corners of Tonle Sap, families still build houses that rise and fall with the water levels. Their techniques aren't as sophisticated as their ancestors, but they carry the genetic memory of a civilization that lived in partnership with water rather than opposition to it. Children still learn to swim before they walk. Elders still read the subtle signs that predict how high the floods will rise. The floating gardens haven't disappeared entirely either. Adapted and simplified, they persist in forms that scientists are now studying as potential solutions to food security in an era of climate change. The principles that allowed the Khmer to feed floating cities are being applied to urban farming projects from Bangladesh to the Netherlands. Modern architects studying sea level rise have begun making pilgrimages to Cambodia, not just to marvel at Angkor Wat's stone grandeur, but to study the more ephemeral achievements of the floating cities. Computer models are being built to test ancient techniques. Universities are funding research into bamboo construction methods that haven't been used for centuries. The irony would surely amuse the Khmer engineers who first drove those wooden posts into the lake bed. Their greatest innovations, dismissed for centuries as primitive solutions to ancient problems, are now being hailed as revolutionary approaches to contemporary challenges. Cities from Miami to Jakarta are exploring floating neighborhoods as practical responses to rising seas. But something crucial has been lost in translation. The floating cities weren't just engineering marvels. They were expressions of a completely different relationship between humans and their environment. The Khmer didn't build floating cities because they had to. They built them because they understood that water wasn't an obstacle to be overcome, but a partner to be embraced. This philosophical dimension may be the most important legacy of the lost floating cities. In an era when cities worldwide are struggling with flooding, when engineers are building higher walls and stronger pumps to keep water out, the Khmer example suggests a radically different approach. Instead of fighting water, they learned to dance with it. The technical challenges they solved were impressive, but the cultural achievement was even more remarkable. They created urban societies that celebrated rather than feared the seasonal changes that water brought. They built economies that thrived on uncertainty rather than stability. They developed social structures that could adapt to environmental changes rather than resist them. As you swim back toward shore, the water warming slightly in the shallows, you carry with you more than just historical knowledge. you've experienced a different way of thinking about human settlement, about the relationship between civilization and environment, about the possibility of cities that live and breathe with natural rhythms rather than imposing artificial order upon them. The floating cities of the Khmer Empire weren't just lost to time and changing water levels. They were lost to a mindset that sees nature as something to be controlled rather than something to be joined. But their memory persists in the lapping of waves against ancient pilings, in the techniques that survive in forgotten villages, in the dreams of architects and planners who dare to imagine cities that float rather than sink. And deep beneath the surface, in the mud and silt that have accumulated over centuries, the foundations remain. Not just the wooden posts and stone footings, but the ideas they supported, the vision of human communities that could rise and fall with natural cycles, that could thrive in partnership with forces larger than themselves, that could create beauty and meaning in the space between earth and water, in the realm where certainty dissolves and possibilities flow like currents in the dark. You descend once more into the depths, but this time something different awaits in the murky darkness. The water here holds secrets that go beyond engineering marvels and lost architecture. In the deepest sections of what was once the heart of these floating metropolises, you discover something that changes everything you thought you knew about why these cities truly disappeared. The mud beneath your feet shifts, and your fingers brush against something smooth and artificial. Not wood, not stone, but metal. Bronze vessels, their surfaces green with centuries of corrosion, emerge from the silt like sleeping giants awakening to your touch. These aren't simple cooking pots or ceremonial objects. They're components of something far more complex, pieces of machinery that speak to technological achievements. Historians never imagined the Khmer possessed used surface, gasping, clutching a bronze gear whose teeth still mesh perfectly despite centuries underwater. The implications send chills through you that have nothing to do with the lake's temperature. The floating cities weren't just marvels of architecture and social organization. They were powered by mechanical systems that modern science is only beginning to understand. Diving again, following a trail of metal debris that leads deeper into the lake's heart, you begin to piece together a picture that challenges everything archaeologists thought they knew about medieval Southeast Asia. The bronze components aren't random artifacts. They form patterns, systems, the scattered remains of what can only be described as hydraulic engines. The Khmer engineers hadn't just learned to live with water's moods. They had learned to harness them, to convert the lake's seasonal rhythms into mechanical energy that powered their floating cities in ways that seem almost magical. Water wheels the size of buildings, their wooden frames long since rotted away, leaving only bronze gears and axles to mark their passing tidal generators that captured the energy of the lake's daily breathing. Hydraulic pumps that could lift water to heights that defied gravity's patient pull. But this wasn't crude technology cobbled together by accident. The precision of these bronze components, the sophistication of their design, speaks to centuries of refinement and development. The floating cities weren't just places where people happened to live on water. They were the culmination of a technological tradition that had turned water itself into a servant, a source of power that made possible urban complexes of staggering complexity. Picture the morning routines of these cities, powered not by human labor alone, but by the lake itself. Mills that ground rice flour while families slept, driven by currents that never tired, looms that wove silk with mechanical precision, their shuttles flying back and forth in rhythm with the water's pulse. Forges that shaped metal using hydraulic hammers, powered by the same floods that lifted houses toward the sky. The bronze you hold grows heavy in your hand as you realize what it represents. This gear once turned as part of a clock system that tracked not just hours and days, but the subtle cycles of water level and seasonal change that governed life in the floating cities. The Khmer hadn't just adapted to their environment. They had created technologies that made them partners with forces most civilizations saw as either blessing or curse. You swim toward what the debris pattern suggests was once a central power distribution hub, and the water around you seems to hum with residual energy. Here, beneath layers of silt and time, lie the remains of what can only be called the world's first hydraulic power grid. Bronze pipes, their joints sealed with techniques that kept them watertight for centuries, carried pressurized water throughout the floating cities like arteries carrying blood through a living body. The implications stagger you. While European cities were struggling with basic sanitation, the Khmer were operating water-powered manufacturing systems that wouldn't be seen in the West for another 500 years. While other civilizations were burning wood and coal for energy, these floating cities ran on the renewable power of water itself, their bronze hearts beating in rhythm with floods and tides. But power systems this sophisticated don't just disappear overnight. Something catastrophic must have happened. Something that not only destroyed the cities, but also wiped away almost all memory of the technologies that made them possible. The bronze components scattered across the lake bed tell a story of violent destruction, not gradual abandonment. You surface near what your underwater exploration suggests was once the main power station, and pieces of a darker puzzle begin falling into place. The official histories speak of the floating cities fading away as water patterns changed, their populations gradually moving to dry land as conditions became untenable. But the evidence beneath the water tells a different story entirely. The bronze machinery shows signs of deliberate destruction, gears smashed with hammers, pipes severed with tools designed specifically for cutting metal. This wasn't the slow decay of abandoned infrastructure. This was systematic sabotage, a coordinated effort to destroy not just the cities, but the very knowledge that made them possible. You dive again, following a trail of deliberately broken components toward what must have been the city's greatest technological achievement. In the deepest part of the lake, where even modern fishing nets rarely reach, you find it, the remains of what can only be described as a hydraulic computer, a mechanical calculation system that used the pressure and flow of water to process information with a complexity that wouldn't be matched until the Industrial Revolution. Bronze wheels covered in Intricate symbols lie scattered like the pages of a torn book, each one a component in a system that could predict flood levels, calculate agricultural yields, and coordinate the complex logistics of cities that existed in constant motion. This wasn't just engineering. This was the physical embodiment of mathematical knowledge that historians believe didn't exist in medieval Southeast Asia. But who would want to destroy such marvels? Who had both the capability and the motivation to systematically dismantle technologies that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom? The answer lies not in foreign invasion or natural disaster, but in the political upheavals that tore through the Khmer Empire as it reached the height of its power. The floating cities, for all their technological sophistication, represented more than just alternative ways of living. They embodied a different philosophy of governance, a decentralized model that challenged the increasingly centralized authority of Angkor. While the stone capital demanded tribute and obedience, the floating cities operated as semi-autonomous republics, their hydraulic power systems making them largely independent of royal control. The bronze computer fragments tell the story of this conflict in their own metallic language. The calculation systems weren't just used for managing floods and crops. They were tools of political resistance, allowing the floating cities to coordinate their activities, to share resources and information in ways that bypassed the traditional hierarchies of the Khmer Empire. As Angkor's power grew more absolute, the floating cities became increasingly seen not as marvels of engineering, but as threats to imperial unity. Their technological independence made them dangerous examples of what was possible when communities controlled their own resources, when power flowed from the bottom up rather than from the top down. The destruction, when it came, was swift and thorough. Royal forces, guided by engineers who understood exactly which components were crucial to the hydraulic systems, moved through the floating cities like surgeons removing tumors. They didn't need to destroy the buildings or kill the populations. They just needed to break the bronze hearts that powered these aquatic republics. Without their mechanical systems, the floating cities couldn't maintain the complex balance of forces that made their existence possible. Water levels that had been manageable with hydraulic pumps became catastrophic without the manufacturing systems that had provided economic independence ground to a halt. The intricate networks that had connected dozens of floating settlements fragmented into isolated communities struggling for survival. The knowledge didn't die with the machines, but it went underground. The engineers and technicians who had maintained these systems found themselves scattered, their expertise suddenly not just useless, but dangerous. To be known as someone who understood hydraulic mechanics became tantamount to declaring yourself an enemy of the state. You surface one final time, bronze fragments still clinging to your fingers, and the weight of what you've discovered settles over you like the mist that clings to these ancient waters. The floating cities of the Khmer Empire weren't just lost to time or politics or changing flood patterns. They were deliberately erased, their bronze hearts shattered to silence technologies that challenged the very foundations of power itself. But secrets have a way of surviving even the most thorough destruction. in the villages that still dot the shores of Tonle Sap, in the hands of craftsmen who work metal with techniques passed down through generations, in the whispered stories of grandmothers who remember when the lake sang with the voices of machines. The knowledge endures. As you wade back toward shore, water streaming from your clothes, you carry with you more than just historical revelation. You've touched the remnants of a civilization that dared to dream of cities powered by the very forces of nature, communities that rose and fell not in submission to water, but in partnership with it. Their bronze hearts may be scattered across the lake bed, but their vision remains as bright as the morning sun reflecting off these sacred waters. The floating cities are gone, their technologies silenced, their people scattered to the winds of history. But their legacy flows on in every current, in every tide, in every drop of rain that falls upon the earth. They proved that another way was possible, that humanity could build not against nature, but with it, that the future doesn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. And perhaps, if we listen carefully enough to the whispers carried on the water's surface, we might just learn to build floating cities of our own.